In this video, we will examine a disturbing pattern behind several highly controversial cases involving female educators whose crimes surfaced in recent years. These are not distant scandals from the past. They are modern cases unfolding in real courtrooms, affecting real children, families, and communities today. What makes them alarming is not only the brutality or abuse itself, but how trust, authority, and gender assumptions repeatedly delayed accountability. Jacqueline Ma, State, California, age 36. In 2022, few titles in American society carry more moral weight than elementary school teacher, and fewer still are awarded publicly for excellence. That is what makes what followed with Jacqueline Ma not just criminal, but profoundly disturbing. Within 3 years of that award, Ma would be standing in a courtroom facing a sentence of 30 years to life, convicted not of professional failure, but of exploiting the very children she was sworn to protect. Jacqueline Ma taught at Lincoln Acres Elementary School in San Diego, California, a campus built around routine, structure, and parental trust. She was known for strong classroom management, engagement with students, and what colleagues described as a calm, nurturing demeanor. Nothing in her public record hinted at danger. That veneer mattered. In cases involving authority figures, credibility is often the strongest shield a predator can possess. The trust Ma accumulated over years did not raise suspicion. It silenced it. Parents believed their children were safe because the system told them so. Between 2023 and 2024, that trust collapsed. Investigators would later determine that Ma had engaged in repeated abusive conduct involving 2 male students under the age of 14. The acts were not isolated mistakes or boundary slips. Prosecutors characterized them as deliberate and sustained. Beyond physical assault, detectives uncovered evidence that Ma possessed illicit images involving minors, material that crossed a clear legal and moral line. The case did not unravel through internal school oversight or random discovery. It came apart because a child spoke up. A report from one victim triggered a police investigation that quickly exposed a pattern rather than a single incident. The emotional gravity of the case rested not only on what happened, but on where it happened. These were not crimes committed in shadows or distant locations. They occurred within the orbit of a classroom, under the protection of an adult whose role was to safeguard learning and innocence. For jurors and the public alike, the betrayal carried as much weight as the acts themselves. This was not a stranger danger case. It was an authority abuse case, one that forced uncomfortable questions about how easily trust can be weaponized. In February 2025, Jacqueline Ma entered a guilty plea in San Diego Superior Court. There was no dramatic trial revelation, no claim of misunderstanding or accident. The plea acknowledged the scope of the harm and eliminated any ambiguity about culpability. 3 months later, in May 2025, the court imposed a sentence of 30 years to life in prison, explicitly denying early parole consideration. The judge emphasized the vulnerability of the victims and the calculated nature of the abuse, noting that Ma's position amplified the damage far beyond the individual acts. This case leaves behind more than a conviction. It leaves a scar on a community that once applauded, a school forced to reckon with oversight failures, and victims who must rebuild trust in a world that taught them authority meant safety. Jacqueline Ma's story is not just about a fallen teacher. It is about how quickly respect can become a blindfold, and how devastating the cost can be when that blindfold is finally removed. Leslie Jenea Chance, State, California, age 58. For years, from the outside, Leslie Jenea Chance's life appeared stable: a 20-year marriage, 3 daughters, and a career built on responsibility. That is precisely why the crime that followed felt so unsettling. When investigators uncovered that Chance had meticulously planned the murder of her own husband. The shock was not only in the violence, but in the calculation behind it. The marriage between Leslie Chance and her husband, Todd Chance, an engineer, had quietly deteriorated behind closed doors. By 2013, tension and resentment had replaced the appearance of domestic normalcy. According to prosecutors, what ignited everything was jealousy, specifically, text messages that Leslie interpreted as flirtatious. To many couples, such messages might lead to arguments, separation, or counseling. In this case, they became the emotional trigger for something far darker. Rather than confronting the collapse of her marriage openly, Chance began to retreat inward, nurturing suspicion and rage, while maintaining her professional image in public. What distinguishes this case from a crime of sudden passion is the degree of planning involved. Evidence later presented in court showed that Leslie Chance did not act impulsively. She studied crime. She reportedly visited a CSI-themed exhibition, absorbing forensic concepts that she believed could help her get away with murder. Prosecutors argued that she constructed a plan rooted in misdirection, using her husband's own firearm, staging the scene, and disposing of his body in a remote field. After killing Todd, she attempted to erase herself from the timeline by driving his vehicle, creating the illusion that he had left voluntarily. It was a calculated effort to manufacture doubt. But modern investigations leave few shadows untouched. Surveillance cameras captured movements that contradicted her story. Forensic evidence told a different narrative than the one Chance tried to construct. Blood patterns, vehicle data, and digital records slowly dismantled the version of events she offered to authorities. What she believed were clever details became the very threads that unraveled her plan. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, the image of a grieving wife collapsed into that of a methodical killer. The legal process was nearly as complex as the crime itself. Leslie Chance faced 2 trials, the first ending in a mistrial due to procedural issues, a delay that only intensified public scrutiny. When the case returned to court, prosecutors focused on premeditation, emphasizing the planning, the use of forensic knowledge, and the deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. In January 2020, a jury convicted her of first-degree murder. The verdict marked a definitive rejection of any narrative portraying the killing as accidental or emotionally uncontrollable. In September 2020, the sentence was delivered 50 years to life in prison, with no possibility of early parole. The court acknowledged not only the loss of Todd Chance's life, but the broader impact: 3 daughters left without a father, and a community forced to reconcile how someone entrusted with children could commit such an act. Leslie Jenea Chance's case stands as a chilling reminder that authority and education do not immunize against violence. Sometimes, they simply provide better tools to hide it, until the truth inevitably surfaces. Nancy Ann Seaman, State, Michigan, age 73. In May 2004, a longtime elementary school teacher in Farmington Hills, Michigan, Nancy Ann Seaman, would ultimately be convicted of a killing so violent that the details alone dominated headlines. Her husband, Robert Seaman, an engineer, was struck 16 times with an axe and stabbed 21 times with a knife. The shock did not come only from the brutality, but from the contrast. For years, the Seaman's marriage appeared outwardly stable, but behind closed doors, it was marked by escalating conflict. Testimony would later describe a relationship strained by arguments, resentment, and allegations of domestic abuse. Nancy Seaman leaned heavily on the image of a trapped wife, telling friends and authorities that she feared her husband and felt cornered by the prospect of divorce. The events of that May evening unfolded after a heated argument about separation. According to prosecutors, Robert Seaman went into the garage. Nancy followed. What happened next was not a single impulsive blow, but a prolonged, escalating attack. Evidence showed she struck him repeatedly with an axe, then switched weapons and stabbed him dozens of times. The medical findings told a story of sustained violence rather than a brief struggle. After Robert was dead, Ann Seaman did not call for help. Instead, she attempted to control the aftermath. She concealed the body, cleaned parts of the scene, and, most damningly, purchased a new axe in an apparent attempt to distance herself from the murder weapon. That attempt failed. Blood evidence remained despite cleanup efforts, and investigators quickly identified inconsistencies between Seaman's account and the physical facts. Forensic analysis contradicted claims of self-defense, showing the victim had little opportunity to fight back, and that the wounds were inflicted in a manner inconsistent with panic or immediate threat. The narrative of a frightened wife collapsed under scientific scrutiny. What remained was evidence of intent, follow-through, and post-crime behavior aimed at deception. The case went to trial in November 2004, drawing intense attention because it sat at the intersection of two emotionally charged issues: domestic abuse and extreme violence. Prosecutors emphasized the number of wounds, the weapon switch, and the steps taken after the killing as proof of premeditation. In 2005, a jury convicted Ann Seaman of first-degree murder with premeditation. The sentence was uncompromising: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In 2012, her appeals were exhausted, leaving the conviction intact. Ann Seaman's case endures because it challenges easy assumptions. It forces a reckoning with how narratives of victimhood can obscure reality, and how courts must separate sympathy from evidence. In the end, the verdict delivered a stark conclusion. This was not an act of survival, but a deliberate killing, carried out by someone who understood both violence and the trust her public role once inspired. Carolyn Warmus, State, New York, age 61. In the late 1980s, Carolyn Warmus became a name that tabloids and courtrooms alike could not let go of. She was young, intelligent, wealthy, and carried a rare sume that seemed incompatible with violence. An elementary school teacher in New York, and the daughter of a millionaire. Yet in January 1989, Warmus was accused of committing a crime so cold and personal that the media quickly branded her the Fatal Attraction Killer, a nickname drawn from the popular film that had recently embedded itself into the American imagination. Carolyn Warmus lived a life of privilege, but emotionally, she was entangled in something far messier. She was romantically involved with Paul Solomon, a fellow teacher who was married to Betty Jen Solomon. The relationship existed in the shadows, fueled by secrecy, promises, and mounting frustration. Prosecutors later described Warmus as deeply invested in the affair, increasingly resentful of the fact that Paul would not leave his wife. To friends, she appeared emotionally volatile, swinging between hope and despair. In cases like this, motive is often invisible until it suddenly becomes overwhelming. Jealousy, rejection, and obsession formed the psychological backdrop that investigators would later place at the center of the crime. On a winter night in January 1989, Betty Jen Solomon was found shot to death inside her home. She had been struck 9 times, a number that immediately suggested rage rather than accident. There were no signs of forced entry, no neighbors who heard a clear disturbance, and no immediate suspect standing over the body. The case could have gone cold. Instead, detectives began tracing relationships rather than physical clues. Phone records revealed repeated calls between Carolyn Warmus and Paul Solomon around the time of the murder. Investigators also focused on Warmus's access to firearms, eventually linking her to a gun consistent with the murder weapon. Still, the absence of direct physical evidence created doubt. This was not a straightforward whodunit. It was a case built on inference, motive, and behavior. When the case went to trial in 1991, that uncertainty divided the jury. After weeks of testimony, the panel deadlocked 8-4 in favor of conviction, resulting in a mistrial. The split highlighted the central tension of the case. Was Carolyn Warmus a spurned lover who crossed an unforgivable line, or a convenient suspect shaped by narrative rather than proof? Prosecutors regrouped, refining their argument to emphasize obsession, opportunity, and circumstantial consistency. In 1992, a second jury reached a verdict. Warmus was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The conviction did not end debate. Over the years, Warmus maintained her innocence, and supporters pointed to the lack of definitive forensic evidence as grounds for doubt. Others argued that the totality of circumstances, motive, timing, and access painted a clear picture of guilt. After serving 27 years, Carolyn Warmus was released on parole in 2019, stepping back into a world vastly different from the one she left behind. Her case endures because it sits at the intersection of obsession and ambiguity. It asks a question that true crime often circles but rarely answers cleanly when evidence is indirect. How much certainty is enough to justify a lifetime behind bars? And when a story fits a narrative too perfectly, are we convicting the crime or the character we believe someone to be? John Struven Harris, State, New York, age 89. In the spring of 1980, the carefully cultivated image of Jean Harris collapsed in a single night of gunfire. Harris was not a woman the public associated with chaos or violence. She was the poised, disciplined headmistress of the prestigious Madeira School in Virginia, an elite girls' academy that symbolized refinement, structure, and moral authority. To parents and donors, she represented stability and class. That is why the revelation that she had shot and killed her longtime lover, celebrity physician Herman Tarnauer, sent shockwaves far beyond the crime itself. The scandal was not only that a man had been killed, but that the woman who pulled the trigger insisted it was all a tragic accident. June Harris and Herman Tarnauer had been romantically involved for 14 years, a relationship marked by imbalance and quiet desperation. Tarnauer, famous as the author of the Scarsdale Diet, was charismatic, wealthy, and accustomed to admiration. Harris, despite her professional success, occupied a more fragile emotional position in the relationship. Over time, Tarnauer's repeated infidelities eroded what remained of their bond. Friends later described Harris as increasingly anxious, fearful of abandonment, and emotionally dependent. What looked from the outside like an elegant affair was, in reality, a long cycle of rejection and reconciliation that left Harris feeling disposable. On a March night in 1980, Harris drove to Tarnauer's home in Purchase, New York, carrying a loaded handgun. According to her later statements, she intended to confront him and possibly to end her own life. What unfolded instead was a heated argument that spiraled out of control. During the confrontation, Harris fired 4 shots, striking Tarnauer and killing him. Almost immediately afterward, she called the police. There was no attempt to flee, no elaborate cover-up. Instead, Harris claimed the gun discharged accidentally during a struggle, framing the killing as an unintended consequence of emotional turmoil rather than an act of deliberate violence. That explanation became the central fault line of the case. Prosecutors argued that the number of shots alone undermined any claim of accident. 4 bullets, they said, reflected intent, not chaos. The defense countered with a portrait of a woman at the edge of despair, emotionally abused and mentally unstable, incapable of premeditation. The trial in 1981 was as much about character as it was about evidence. Harris's composure, education, and social standing stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the act, forcing jurors to reconcile who she was supposed to be with what she had done. The jury ultimately rejected the accident narrative. John Harris was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The verdict marked a dramatic fall from grace, from headmistress of an elite school to an inmate identified by a number. Harris served 12 years behind bars, during which her health deteriorated. In 1992, citing serious medical concerns, New York Governor Mario Cuomo granted her executive clemency, and she was released from prison. The John Harris case endures because it complicates the idea of violence. It challenges the assumption that murder always comes from rage alone, rather than prolonged emotional erosion. It also raises an uncomfortable question about perception. Did Harris's refined image delay moral judgment, or intensify the sense of betrayal once the truth emerged? In the end, the case reminds us that even lives built on discipline and prestige can unravel catastrophically when control gives way to desperation. Fiona Beal, State, England, age of 51. In November 2021, the quiet suburban calm of Northampton was pierced by a crime so intimate and meticulously concealed that it would later unsettle even veteran investigators. Fiona Beal, a primary school teacher entrusted daily with young children, would ultimately be convicted of murdering her long-term partner and burying his body in their own garden. What made the case particularly chilling was not only the act itself, but what followed. Back to the beginning, Fiona Beal had lived with Nicholas Billingham for 17 years. To outsiders, they appeared to be a long-standing couple navigating the ordinary stresses of adult life. Inside the home, however, the relationship was described in court as controlling and coercive. Billingham's behavior, according to Beal's later admissions, dominated the household and eroded her sense of autonomy over time. This dynamic became central to how the defense framed her mental state, though it would not absolve her actions. The tension between victimhood and culpability would remain a defining feature of the case. On the night of the killing, Beal did not act in a moment of visible chaos. Prosecutors established that she deliberately lured Billingham into a bedroom under false pretenses. There, she stabbed him in the neck, a targeted and lethal wound. The violence was swift, but the aftermath was prolonged and deliberate. Rather than contacting authorities or seeking help, Beal began a methodical effort to erase him. She wrapped his body, dragged it through the house, and buried it in a shallow grave in the backyard. Over the soil, life continued, grass grew, neighbors passed by, and no one suspected that a grave lay just beneath the surface. For months, Beal maintained control of the narrative. She sent text messages from Billingham's phone to friends and family, explaining his absence with plausible excuses. She reported him missing, presenting herself as a worried partner. At the same time, she wrote privately in her diary, documenting her internal justifications, her fear of discovery, and her attempts to normalize life after the killing. Those writings would later become some of the most disturbing evidence in the case, revealing a consciousness of guilt alongside emotional detachment. The illusion collapsed in March 2022, when Billingham's remains were discovered in the garden. Once confronted with the physical evidence, the digital trail, and her own writings, Beal's version of events unraveled rapidly. Unlike many defendants in high-profile murder cases, she did not take the matter to a contested trial. In April 2024, at London's Old Bailey, Fiona Beal pleaded guilty to murder. The admission removed any lingering doubt about responsibility, even as arguments about coercive control were raised during sentencing to explain, though not excuse, her actions. In May 2024, the court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years before parole eligibility. The judge emphasized the calculated nature of the killing and the prolonged deception that followed. noting that the concealment inflicted additional harm on the victim's family. Fiona Beal's case stands as a stark reminder that violence does not always erupt outwardly. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, behind familiar walls, sustained not by rage alone, but by planning, secrecy, and the chilling ability to pretend that nothing has happened at all. Alissa McCommon, State, Tennessee, age 40. In a case that shook a small Tennessee community to its core, Alissa McCommon became the embodiment of a nightmare parents rarely want to imagine. McCommon was a fourth-grade teacher in Covington, Tennessee, someone entrusted daily with children barely out of elementary school. That trust disintegrated when investigators revealed she had sexually assaulted a 12-year-old student, a crime that ultimately resulted in pregnant. The shock was not confined to a single victim. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered evidence suggesting McCommon had used social media to groom and communicate inappropriately with other minors as well, exposing a broader pattern of predatory behavior hidden behind a classroom door. McCommon's professional role gave her unusual access and authority. As a teacher, she occupied a position that naturally dissolved boundaries, after-school help, private conversations, and parental confidence were all part of the job. Prosecutors later emphasized that this authority was not incidental to the crime, it was central to it. McCommon did not approach her victim as a stranger. She leveraged familiarity, reassurance, and the credibility that comes with being the teacher to normalize contact that should never have existed. In cases like this, grooming is rarely sudden. It is incremental, designed to blur lines slowly enough that the child does not recognize danger until it is too late. Between 2021 and 2023, the abuse escalated. Investigators established that McCommon engaged in repeated sexual contact with the student, including encounters that took place at her home. The power imbalance was absolute, adult versus child, teacher versus student. When it came to pregnant, the situation could no longer remain hidden. The disclosure triggered a criminal investigation that quickly expanded beyond the initial allegation. Law enforcement reviewed digital communications and social media activity, searching for additional victims and patterns of behavior consistent with grooming. What emerged was deeply troubling. Messages suggested McCommon had communicated with multiple minors in ways that crossed professional and legal boundaries. While not all contacts resulted in charges, the evidence painted a picture of calculated manipulation rather than isolated misconduct. Prosecutors described a teacher who understood the vulnerabilities of children and exploited them deliberately, hiding behind the respectability of her profession. The case moved toward resolution in December 2024, when Alissa McCommon entered a guilty plea. She admitted to 12 criminal counts, including sexual assault and exploitation of a minor. The plea spared the victim from testifying in open court, but it also marked a formal acknowledgement of responsibility. At sentencing, the court focused on the long-term harm inflicted, not only the physical consequences of the abuse, but the psychological trauma and lifelong impact on a child whose education and sense of safety had been irrevocably altered. McCommon was sentenced to 25 years in prison, a term intended to reflect both punishment and protection. The judge also imposed strict prohibitions, barring her from any contact with the victim's children in the future, underscoring the court's view that her access to minors represented a continuing danger. The sentence sent a clear message: grooming under the guise of education is not a lapse in judgment. It is a serious felony deserving of severe consequences. Jennifer Fichter, State, Florida, age 41. In Polk County, Florida, Jennifer Fichter was a high school English teacher, someone tasked with shaping language, ethics, and critical thinking in teenagers on the edge of adulthood. when prosecutors revealed that she had engaged in sexual relationships with 3 17-year-old male students, totaling more than 37 separate encounters. The community reaction was a mix of disbelief and misplaced minimization. What ultimately shattered any illusion of romance was the court's conclusion: this was not love, it was exploitation. Jennifer Fichter's position placed her in daily, unsupervised proximity to minors. As an English teacher, she built rapport through conversation, mentoring, and personal attention, tools that can inspire students when used appropriately. Prosecutors argued that Fichter weaponized those tools instead. Over time, boundaries dissolved, replaced by secrecy and emotional dependence. The students were legally underage, academically subordinate, and psychologically vulnerable. None of that changed simply because they were close to adulthood. In the eyes of the law, the imbalance of power defined the relationship, regardless of how it was framed privately. Between 2011 and 2014, the sexual encounters occurred in multiple locations inside cars, at Fichter's home, and even on school grounds. The repetition mattered. This was not a single lapse or impulsive mistake. It was a sustained pattern of behavior that required planning, concealment, and deliberate risk-taking. Investigators later described how Fichter maintained secrecy, relying on the silence of teenagers who feared consequences or believed they were participating willingly. That silence broke only when one student confided in his parents, triggering a police investigation that quickly expanded as more victims came forward. As detectives gathered evidence, the scope of the abuse became undeniable. Text messages, witness statements, and timelines established that Fichter had exploited her role repeatedly over several years. When confronted, she did not deny the relationships. Instead, her defense centered on a claim that would ultimately fail, that the relationships were consensual and based on genuine affection. In court, that argument collapsed under scrutiny. Judges and prosecutors emphasized that consent is legally impossible in teacher-student sexual relationships, precisely because authority distorts choice. In March 2015, Jennifer Fichter entered a guilty plea to 37 counts of sexual abuse. The plea acknowledged not only the acts themselves but their frequency and duration. At sentencing in July 2015, the court imposed a 22-year prison sentence, reflecting both the number of offenses and the breach of trust involved. The judge rejected any suggestion that emotional attachment mitigated the harm, stating that the damage inflicted extended far beyond the physical acts. Appeals filed in 2016 and 2017 were unsuccessful, leaving the conviction and sentence intact. The Jennifer Fichter case resonates because it confronts a dangerous cultural double standard. When female teachers abuse male students, public discourse too often drifts toward jokes, minimization, or misplaced envy. The courtroom response was unequivocal: harm is harm, regardless of gender. Fichter's conviction stands as a reminder that authority-based abuse does not require force to be devastating. Sometimes, it arrives wrapped in praise, attention, and the false promise of affection, leaving consequences that last long after the classroom lights are turned off. These cases leave us with more than verdicts and prison sentences. They leave unresolved questions about oversight, bias, and how society defines danger. When those entrusted with education cross into exploitation or violence, the damage reaches far beyond individual victims. Were these crimes inevitable failures of character, or warnings of deeper systemic blind spots? And most importantly, have we learned enough to prevent the next case? Or are we still looking away?